Malmstrom. I am a history teacher at the Ellis School in Pittsburgh.
Okay, and can you talk about a specific example of where you use the Classroom Salon in your class?
I started using Classroom Salon this year in my AP Government class because I wanted a new way for my students to talk about politics, because it's an area as 17 and 18-year-olds that they're very new to, and they are still developing identities. And so after the last immediately after that election, there were questions about the future of the Republican Party. What was the Republican Party? Who was the Republican Party? And I came across a really, really well done piece in the New York Times that dealt with the question. And rather than simply having my students read it and respond to it, I wanted them to read it and to comment upon biases they saw within the article and see what parts of the article and statements within the article actually resonated with them, and then have an opportunity to comment on those, and then an opportunity to comment on the observations of the other students. And that was really my first real try with Classroom Salon, at least with that class. And the girls absolutely ran with it. There were several girls who had literally dozens of posts on this one article in responses to other girls. So it was really more effective even than I would have guessed, and it led to remarkable discussion the following days in class because we had a baseline to start from.
So you put this New York Times article in the Classroom Salon, and when students were able to annotate it that night, did you let them see each other's posts? Did they just see their own? And did they have a discussion question or something to follow? How did that all work?
I had several broad questions as sort of discussion starters, and the way I set it up is I did not allow them to see each other's responses at first. And then they each responded to it individually, selecting pieces of the text that they were effective to them. And then the following day, I switched it so that they could see each other's responses, and then they began to respond to what each of them were saying.
And when you looked at then that evening what students were commenting on, was there any surprises? Was there power in what you were seeing? What were some of the things?
Well, they couldn't see what their classmates were responding to. So what I saw in the analytics was I could see which statements really were important to them, that they were affected by, that they thought were important, or that they felt were very, very biased, and could get a better sense of kind of where they were coming down. And there were some surprises there. There were statements that a number of them focused upon that I really wouldn't have expected them to, and that also led to even more discussion once they could see each other's posts. That led them to question and comment what each of them had seen.
So then when you were in class the next day, or when you were in class when you talked about this next, how did it change the way you interacted with them in class?
Well, sort of the old-time way of doing this is I would find this article, I would probably Xerox it and hand it out to them, and maybe give them a few questions to answer about it and tell them to come back with it the next day. Some of them would really dig into this, some of them wouldn't. They would share, they would talk to each other about their answers, and they would essentially just kind of give me what I wanted. They can't do that with Classroom Salon because they are writing purely as individuals. They can't see what the others are doing even if they want to. But that's step one. Step two is then they can respond to what each other is saying, or what each student is saying. And so it's really a two-day process, really, because you deal with the article and the initial responses one day for part of a class, and then they go back to it and they can see each other's responses, and then the next day you deal with their responses to each other's responses, which makes it even more powerful.
Yeah, and so then when you were in the classroom and they were talking about those responses, did you think that they were more engaged than normal? Was the discussion richer?
No question, no question. Had I done this in the traditional way, I would have led the discussion. As this was, they led the discussion. Not only did they lead the discussion, they were anxious to lead the discussion, and I had to shut them up. They were very, very, very engaged. And like I said, these are 17-year-olds who are developing political identities for themselves, and this is the best way for them to do that.
Yeah, and from you as a teacher, how did it change how you prepare for class? What did you have to do differently? What does the timing look like to do something like this?
Well, what I did was, and again, I'm relatively new at this, I gave the assignment one day, and they worked on it typically at home that evening. And then in the morning, I went to their responses before class just to get a sense of where they were, to help me begin to lead the discussion once we got to class. And that worked pretty well.
And what are some of the ways that you might want to use Classroom Salon in the future in your classroom?
Well, in that classroom, in the government class, again, it's especially useful because politics, it's so much about perceptions, where their parents are, what they read in the newspaper, what they see on TV. So it's a very, very, very interpretive kind of moving target, and it lends itself well to the ability for them to really question and comment what each other are saying. It's a conversation, but it's a very tightly organized conversation. No, that's wrong. It's not a tightly organized conversation because it can go wherever it wants to, but you can see it. I can see it as a teacher, and if I want them to, they can see it as students.
So what about the idea, do you think you would ever use the analytics to help you see where students are struggling and then potentially adjust things in your class based off of that?
I use the analytics, and again, still getting used to this, but it's a really remarkable tool to be able to allow you to see, again, what's really resonating with students, number one. And number two, you always have students in any classroom who are going to respond, and those who maybe are a little less willing to for whatever reason. And you know who they are. And they know you know who they are, and so they really can't do that. There's a baseline, and they have to meet it. And they do, and the analytics are really good at that. It's just a means, it's a way of assessing the new classroom. That's really what it is.
So I think we want to reiterate again about the idea of how does this process actually work in your classroom? How does it change what you do as a teacher?
Well, again, what I do is, in the old days, I would have assigned and handed out an article that I wanted them to read, given them perhaps a few questions to respond to, and then had them come back the next day and discussed it in class. I would have led the discussion, I would have asked the questions, and they would have responded to the questions that I asked, and probably not a whole lot more than that. But with Classroom Salon, what I can do is I may supply them with some guiding questions. This is a starting point, but then I ask them to respond individually to what they read and what really affects them and what they really respond to. And the way I do that is I make this into essentially a two-day process. I assign them the article reading, and then as individuals I ask them to respond to a set of prompts that I give them. They do that. They cannot see each other, how their classmates are responding, because I haven't allowed them to do that yet. Then the next day we discuss what they've responded to, the points that they focused upon, and then I open it up so that they can see each other's responses, and then I ask them to respond to what their classmates are saying. So that's really the second part of the process, and that's where it really gets to be fun, and really gets to, you go in, you're not sure what direction you're going to go in, and you shouldn't be. You don't need to be. The students drive that. So the new classroom is not, and I've been teaching for a few years, more than a few, in a very teacher-centered sort of traditional style. And what's starting to happen more and more in the new classroom, I can see, and because a teacher, whatever kind of teacher you are, you want your students to be engaged, and you want to find ways to motivate them to be engaged. And that is what Salon really does, although I didn't realize just how powerful it is, because it gives them some control over the direction of discussion, it gives them control over the questions that you ask, it gives them an ability to respond in a way outside of the classroom that really allows them to think about what they're saying. And what it means is your time in the classroom becomes even more valuable because it brings everybody back together face to face again, and you know going in what they've said, because you can see it in the analytics very, very easily. And so you, in that respect, discussion is still sort of teacher-led, but only in the most basic way, because you can look at the analytics, they can't. But beyond that, you're again just sort of guiding discussion in certain directions, but they're doing it themselves otherwise. And that's remarkable.
So if a teacher is just getting started, what's your advice to them?
You need to think about how you spend your time differently. You really do. And rather than focusing on content and presentation of content in class, you need to find a way to present that outside of class, which really there are lots of effective ways to do. And that makes classroom time more valuable and more meaningful because students are really thinking at a much deeper level than they were before. I like.
Right.
Ask me again.
Okay, so what advice do you have for a teacher that's just getting started with Salon or actually using time differently in the classroom?
When I started teaching years ago, classroom time was to present information to students, and it was time for students to take notes about what you were saying as a teacher, entirely teacher directed. What Classroom Salon means is that you need and want to spend a lot less time doing that in the classroom. Instead, you want to spend time in the classroom talking about issues, talking about events, talking about analysis, and letting students direct that. And Classroom Salon allows you to do that because they can begin that process outside of class.
How's your system? Most of that was actually usable, but let's do it one more time.
3 times a charm.
Yeah.
So to any teacher just getting started with Classroom Salon, what advice do you have for them?
When I started teaching years ago, teaching history years ago, it was understood that classes were a time for teachers to present information to students and for students to absorb it, period. End of story. And that's no longer true today. Students will have nothing to do with that. Not nothing to do with it. Students don't want that, and we don't want that because it's not a good way of teaching. We know that. And Classroom Salon allows you to... I lost my train of
from Classroom Salon last year.
I lost my train of thought. Classroom Salon allows you to begin the process of discussion and analysis outside of class because it provides a framework for students to do that and a means for you as a teacher to follow what they're doing. You don't direct it totally, you don't guide it directly, it's largely self-directed by the students, but you can see at every step along the way exactly what they're doing. And that's powerful. And that leads you to further discussion, deeper discussion, more analysis, and what I would call greater student risk-taking, because to analyze or come to a conclusion for a 17-year-old is a risky proposition. But they're willing to do it, especially willing to do it when they can do it in an environment that you have in the Classroom Salon.
To not waste your time teaching that rote memorization, that type of stuff.
Well, what it really does is it forces you to focus on depth rather than breadth. And what that means is that time being precious, you may have less time to actually present material. You may be able to cover, and put that in quotes, cover less. But what you do, you'll do more completely, more thoughtfully, and in a very, very real sense, students will have a much, much deeper understanding of what you're trying to get across to them, which is far, far, far more valuable.